In this journey down memory lane, I'm going to go into a few of the things to get started working with HTML and CSS. Now, a few key things about this. This is not an exhaustive study. This is not necessarily even a proper study. This is going to be giving you some context so you can make good choices as you are using HTML and CSS in your web pages. So there's a lot that we can go into. It's a subject that is ever changing, ever growing, and there's just so many amazing and awesome things that you can do. But we need to understand a few key things as we work with this. So back in the day, we would just use HTML tags, and then to do our page layouts, we used tables as a way to do it because there was no other effective way to go about doing it. Then the next thing that people started doing is they started using divs. So I would use a div to define a section in my page, and then I would make a ID on it so it would uniquely identify it, such as header. Then we would have one for our main section of our page. Then we would have one for our footer. We'd even have a div for our nav. So we'd go div, 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 and then we would put divs inside of divs inside of divs inside of divs, because in doing so, I can now target those with CSS positioning. So using floats and using layout and doing all of that fun stuff to construct my web page. And it would look okay on some devices, and other devices it would explode if they had a really big screen, a really small screen. It was really hard to predict, and it was often a huge pain in the butt. It was not a great way of working. But yeah, it gave me a page, and I would get a page. Now there's no CSS on it, so that's butt ugly, and deal with it. But we use divs, and it sucked. And then along came HTML5, where they recognized it's like, hey, we're using a div, and a div, when we look at it, what is a div tag? A div tag is just an empty tag. It's a way to contain some content so I can target it and do something with it. But it has no meaning. The only meaning is what I've attached to it through my ID. So when I put an ID on it and call it a header, or call it main, call it footer, call it nav, call it whatever I want, well, I'm creating the meaning at that point. But the reality is, if we try and think about this from accessibility, if we try and think about it from a screen reader going through it and trying to parse and understand and go, how should something be emphasized? How should it be processed and understood? Well, every designer could label things a little bit differently. There was no consistency. So HTML5 came out with semantic tags that meant something. So if we look at a semantic cheat sheet, well, the title is something that's always been part of our document, but now we have things like main, like header, like footer, like nav, like aside, section. These are now key components that we can use for defining content on our page. Most of them are pretty self-explanatory. Article, section, and aside are a little bit different. So if we think about an article, if I go to a page that maybe lists a bunch of short little blurbs for a blog, and it would have each entry, it would show up as an article. We could also use section. I mean, there's a lot of overlap on those. Aside is the one that really is kind of different. Aside would be if you had, say, a sidebar and it maybe just has a listing of your social media icons, a repeat of some of your site navigation. Maybe it shows some of your ads that you put on your site. So the stuff that's not really important for understanding the content on our page. So that's how that works a little bit differently. But the fact that we now have a tag called header, a tag called nav, called main, called footer, these are huge because we don't have to make these nonsensical things that are a div and put an ID on them. We can have tags that mean something. So when we construct our page, we're doing it semantically, so we're wrapping our content in the correct tag to give it meaning. So another resource on it, and a simple Google search for Semantic HTML brings you to a lot of different places. These are some quick ones that I found that I thought were easy to read through. The Codecademy one is pretty good too, goes into some of it. We have some other ones, figure, which also then gets its kind of child tag of fig caption. So if you have a picture and you want to put a caption with it, you use figure and then you put the image tag inside it, as is illustrated in the code over here. You put the caption with it. And the reason we do this is now it's really easy to target these things with specific style rules. So in my CSS, I can just target the figure of how I want my images to be displayed. I can target fig caption for how I want the text to appear underneath it. So I can decide, does it appear underneath? Does it appear on top? Does it appear next to it? Does it appear as an overlay? What font? What color? What size? All those things can be built into it. And it's super easy to target, and I don't have to say div class equals something. And I would, if I was using it with a div, I would use a class, because the reality is that probably have more than one picture, which means I have more than one caption. Therefore, anything that happens more than once is a class. Anything that is a unique element on your page, like your header, like your footer, like your nav, that's going to, then it would have an ID on it because it's occurring one time. But when we just have these tags, our code becomes so much more readable and legible and understandable, and ultimately easier to construct when you are writing your page. So if we jump over into our code editor, and if I have my document as a HTML document, I'm going to jump and do HTML5. Now, using the template out of Visual Studio Code gave me a few other things. It's nice to have the doc type HTML, and this is nice. I don't have to have these long, complicated doc types that had a form that nobody could ever remember because they were written for computers, not for people. Now that we're doing HTML5, we just write HTML. We don't have to say which version or XHTML which version or any of that other stuff, just HTML. It works. Language, well, we're going to do all our writing in language and UTF-8. This one meta tag that it puts in is useful when you start putting in media queries in your CSS. If you don't have this line in your code as a meta tag, and your CSS now targets different viewport sizes, nothing will happen without that line there. So it's important to remember to put it there, or if you're using an editor like Visual Studio Code, it automatically does it and you're good to go. This is the title tag. HTML beginning. Plural. I want to do plural. So now inside my body, this is where my content goes. So instead of going div and then going ID equals header, I can now just go header. I do want to point out that header is not the same as head. So our core HTML documents, we're framing, we have an HTML to start, close HTML to end. Then there are two sections within it. We have the head section and then the body section. And remember, the white space HTML doesn't give a flying leap about white space, so you can just put as much in there as you want, put in comments. Most code editors now, if I want to put in a comment, I can type something. This is a comment, and then Command or Control backslash, and then it turns it into a comment. Hit it again, it uncomments it. So that's a nice way of doing it. So Windows would be Control, Mac it would be Command, and then the slash key. Boom, there you go. That creates a comment. So the head section is used for the browser. The browser is going to get information about our thing. This is where we can put other meta tags where we can include keywords, we can include author information, date information, all kinds of other meta tags. Go Google all the different meta tags that are out there, make yourself happy with that, and it's all good. Title is the only required one that you have to have there. If you're targeting different viewport sizes, of course, you will need the viewport tag or meta tag. And after that, have fun. We also, up in the head, if we either will link to a style sheet, or if we embed our styles in our document, I will also then have the style occur up in the head. It's always good to now separate our content, which is written out with our semantic HTML, from the presentation, which is defined using our CSS, from the interaction, which is in the JavaScript. So we really have three layers to every page. We have our content, which happens with our markup in HTML, our presentation, how it looks and lays out in our screen or viewport, and that is through CSS, our styles, and the interaction and functionality on the page, which happens through JavaScript. So those enhancements to make a better user experience or to communicate with servers and all that fun stuff, that's all JavaScript. So three legs to our stool: JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. The HTML is for the markup and the content, and that's what we're looking at in the beginning here. So I can have a header tag inside my header. Then I may want to either have a banner image that represents it. I could also have a headline for my site, my awesome page, and then inside the header I may have my nav. So I'll use a nav tag, and I could put in my links. I'm not going to bother coding them right now, but if I did have anchor tags around these, so each of my links were then linking to a different section on this page, if it's a one-page app or if it's linking to a different document, that would be happening here as well. And then we could target those anchor tags with our CSS the same way we can target the nav tag, we can target the h1 tag. So all of these things we can now target. But when I look at this, it's now much more readable than having a page where I'm putting in nonsensical, non-semantic tags. And it's just a div. What is a div? Nobody really knows. So we want our tags, our markup, to have some inherent meaning to it. Now for my main body, I can put that in, and then before I go and put in the main body, I'll just go down and put my footer. And it's just wonderful that we now have an actual tag for footer, because the number of times that I would do div id equals footer and then fill it up, div id equals header, fill it up with stuff. Now when I look at this, this makes sense. This is logical. It has inherent meaning to the tags before I've even put any content into it. So now if I wanted to put in something like this, I could put in my copyright. Now we don't want to do 2020 because we just won't speak of 2020. So I can now put that in, and now in my main section here, this is where I could put in maybe an H2 and define my site. And we can now add in paragraphs, we can add in sections. So I could now have a section, which is really a section is a containing element, and within that maybe I'll have a bunch of pictures or text or what have you as part of it. So my content makes sense now. When I read through this, I start to understand that I have some meaning happening here. And we can now see, got a couple sections, got a paragraph in it. I could put multiple paragraphs. I could even have headlines as part of it. So when we're constructing our pages, we want to give it some meaning. And now we load this, you can see there it is. Now I don't have any CSS or any other magic happening right now, but the key thing is that instead of using a bunch of divs to define everything out, I am now using tags that have inherent meaning to them, and I can very easily and readily reference those in my style. So I could reference the body, I could reference the header. So I can just type in header, background color, and I can now choose a color. And now we can see that put a color in for that. I could grab the main, and we'll choose a different color there. And just for kicks, I just want to spread those out. Then we'll grab the footer and add that, give that a background color as well. Now we can see indeed everything is working except for that typo is ugly. Let's try and save that, fix it, good. So now we can see our page is starting to come together. It doesn't have much, there's no layout, there's no other stuff happening, but I am using semantic tags, tags that actually mean something. Now when we are building up our navigation, as it shows here, a common way that we'll do it is we'll use an unordered list, and then each link is a list item. That allows us the flexibility. We can display it inline, we can display them as an inline block or as a block, so we can get our list to show up vertically, we can get it to become horizontal, all kinds of options. Now if we didn't do that, we could include it as separate elements and then work on using something like Flexbox or Grid, which are some topics we will talk about in the future.